everybody, welcome to the end of summer. Just kidding, welcome to the channel. It is Labor Day weekend here in New York City. My name is Ryan, I'm a photographer based in New York City. In today's video, I wanted to talk about shutter speed, and more specifically, about using shutter speed to create emotion in your photos. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because for me, I want a photo to move me. The photos that I connect the most with when I make them and when I view other people's work are photos that move me. They create an emotional response to the photography that is being put in front of me and put out into the world. And I think that as I've been really looking at my own work and the work of people who I find really inspiring, one of the things that I have noticed is that there is a common thread, and that common thread is that most of the images are not tack sharp, pin sharp, crystal clear. Now, certainly there is a time and a place for crystal clear photos. When you are trying to sell a product, when it is e-com, a lot of travel imagery. I mean, the list goes on and on, really. There are lots of ways that shutter and focus can be used to create crystal clear images that tell a very clear story or compel a viewer or a consumer of the photo to take a certain action. That is not what this video is about. This video is about using shutter speed to create an artistic, emotional effect in your photos that will move your audience in some way. And as I think about the word move, a phrase comes to mind that I've already said, and it is, I want a photo to move me. And I think that for a photo to move me, the thing that I have seen as a through line and a commonality between my work and others is that that photo uses motion. Now let's talk a little bit about shutter speed and motion blur. So you can use shutter speed to create motion blur or shutter drag. And at its simplest form, all that means is that your subject is moving faster than the speed at which the shutter opens and closes. So if you have a car that's going 100 miles per hour, but the shutter is only opening at 50 miles per hour, when that shutter opens and closes, the car is going to look as though it is in motion in the frame. You've seen this in lots of photography. Anytime you see those photos of light trails from cars on a freeway or anything like that, that is all shutter drag or motion blur. And that is one of the techniques I want to talk about today, but it's not the only technique. To me, there are essentially two ways or two techniques that you can use your shutter to create an artistic and hopefully emotional effect in your photos. The first is more extreme motion blur or panning in a lot of cases, and the second is using shutter to create the illusion of soft focus. And we'll come back to both of these, but I do want to say that this applies to lots of different types of photography. So the work that I shoot the most in my life is street photography and portraits or fashion photography. This applies to both of those. I use them in different ways in street photography versus fashion photography, but you can use these techniques in any kind of photography. You could even, I guess, use it in macro photography if you wanted to. There's really no limits to the creative ways that you can apply these techniques to your own photos. And I'd encourage you to do so. I'd love to see some of your work if you try some of these techniques, or even if you use it on a regular basis. So let's dive in and start with using shutter to create an artistic effect in your street photography. Okay, so within your street photography, there are essentially sort of two ways that I think about shutter blur. Is it going to be extreme or is it going to be subtle? And what is the intended effect that this motion blur or shutter drag or this manipulation of the shutter speed has or needs to have to create an effect in a photo? And just to say, it's also really easy to manipulate your shutter speed. In my Leicas, it's right here on top. It's just a dial that I turn. Where can you see that? Let's see. And just a note to say, it's super easy to manipulate your shutter speed. You read your shutter as 1 over a number. It's a fraction. It means the fraction of a second in most cases. So 1 over 100 is 1/100th of a second. So the numbers that I say in this video assume that you understand that. And we're mostly talking small numbers or slow numbers. The smaller the number on the bottom half of that fraction, the more time the shutter is open, or therefore the slower the shutter is opening and closing. The bigger that number is, the faster that it's moving. So just to sort of ground us in the terminology that we're going to use here. In street photography, I'm thinking about, do I want really extreme motion blur or really subtle motion blur? The extreme version of motion blur in my work is mostly using a technique called panning. And this is a really cool effect that you see in movies all the time. You've seen it in lots of photography. I use it all the time in my own work. And it is essentially matching your shutter speed to the speed of the object and following it through the frame. It's really easy to do, although a good way to practice, if you've never done this before, is to put your camera, if it's got the ability to go onto a high speed or low speed continuous shutter, where it's gonna bang out a bunch of frames sort of all in a row without having you to hit the shutter multiple times. But with very, very little practice, it's a really easy technique. You can do this in just one shot, even on a manual camera like the Leica M's, which I use all the time. All you need to do is just estimate. It doesn't need to be perfect. And again, this is all meant to create blur and drag and soften focus. So the whole point of this is for it not to be perfect. We don't want perfect images here. We don't want clinically sharp, perfect images. We are going for an emotion or a feeling, not a technical expression of something. We are using the technical element of our camera and what we understand about shutter to create an artistic effect. This is where we take the craft and make it into art. So, estimate the speed of the object in the frame and find that on your shutter speed dial. So for example, in these photos of these motorbikes from Italy, which clearly you can see I was obsessed with, and this is actually from 2 different trips. So I've been this year and once last year, and in both of those trips, I took lots of photos of motorbikes. And I will probably continue to do so any other time I go to Italy, so stay tuned for that. But these are really, really easy to get. You just have to estimate how fast you think these motorbikes are going. For me, I think about it in miles per hour because I'm American, so it was really easy for me to sort of say, it looks like that bike is going 30 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, and to just set my shutter speed to the closest value to that. So this photo was made at 1/30th of a second. This one was made at 1/50th of a second. So most of these photos were made at 1/30th of a second. The motorbikes were just getting going off of the starting line at a red light, just off frame. And as they sped up and sort of came to me, the way to do this is to basically frame the car or the subject. And it doesn't have to be a car, it doesn't have to be a bike, it could be a person, it could be an airplane, it could be anything that you want to freeze in motion. And we'll come back to this with people a little bit later in this street section, but also in the fashion and portraiture section. But all you have to do is just sort of start your frame a little bit before where you actually want to take it. So if you know that you're going to be framing like this, all you want to do is get the object in the center or wherever you want it within your frame and follow it. And all that it takes is for you to hit the shutter right in the place where you want it to be. By you following the object through the frame and matching that shutter speed to the speed that the object is moving, the object will be in focus and appear still while the rest of the frame appears to be in motion. So I'll give you another example. So you've seen the motorbikes and how it works with them and how you can apply it in all different settings. It's really easy to do. The other way that you can apply it, and this isn't technically street photography, but it is sort of situational photography, so events and parties. If you're looking to add a sense of excitement, motion, energy in the same way that we are adding energy and motion to those motorbikes or those Vespas moving through the streets in Italy, these photos, which by the way were made with my iPhone, iPhones and other smartphones are really, really capable these days. You can control the shutter speed in most of them. So these were made with my iPhone 14 Pro at a wedding last fall for a former coworker of mine and a friend of mine who was getting married. Now, the other way that you can use shutter in street photography is the less extreme version. So if the motion blur that's panning is a more extreme version of using shutter drag or motion blur, you can also use a more subtle version. And that subtle version is essentially slowing the shutter speed down just enough so that it looks like the subjects in your frame are in motion. But you're not trying to blur everything out behind them like you would in a panning shot. It would also be really hard to track a human at the speed that we walk, which I think is like 6 miles per hour on average or something like that. So it would be really hard to get a stable photo at that speed using that same panning technique as the motorbikes where you would match the shutter to the subject. In this case, we're not going to be that extreme. We're going to slow our shutter down to 1/125th of a second. So as you are walking down the sidewalk, or you're watching people pass by you, or you're watching people cross the street, you can slow that shutter down to 1/90th or 1/125th and let it be that these people have just a hint of motion, and it really adds a ton of energy to the frame. To me, when I see frames where it looks like people are in motion, but the shutter speed is so fast that they're literally frozen, it almost takes the energy out of them in a lot of cases. Now, I like to use this technique as a way to instill a sense of kinetic energy within my street photos. And it also serves the added benefit of sort of softening everything in the image. The people who are passing you are a little bit softer. Even when they're totally in focus, their movement creates the illusion that they are a little bit out of focus. So I use this a lot in street photography, particularly when I'm looking to capture a sense of motion on the streets. Obviously, I live in New York. There is a ton of energy in our streets here, and it's really, really useful for me when I'm trying to infuse my photos with that sense of energy. Now, if you look at a lot of the works of the great fashion photographers of the 20th century in particular, but even now, 20 years into this new century, a lot of these photographers who are really at the top of their game, think the people who are shooting for Vogue and for Harper's Bazaar and for Elle, a lot of these great photographers, people like Peter Lindbergh, for example, or Brigitte Lacombe, these are photographers who are very deliberately slowing down the shutter to create a soft focus on their characters. And it's not just celebrity photographers and celebrity portraits. It's done a lot in editorial work as well. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it's not used as much in commercial fashion because you really want to be able to see the garment that's being sold or the product, whether it's, a watch or earrings or whatever you're trying to sell in commercial fashion. But in more editorial fashion photography where there's a storytelling component to it, and certainly in a lot of portrait work, it can be really, really effective to add a slightly slow shutter, which creates the illusion of a little bit of a soft focus and a little bit of sort of sensuality or mystery or an ethereal nature to the photos that you are taking. So let's look at a couple of examples and talk through the techniques for when you might use this in your portrait or fashion work. So now, similar to street photography, this is really just about manipulating the shutter to create a little bit of motion. And this applies to men's fashion, this applies to women's fashion, men's portraits, women's portraits. It really applies all across the spectrum. The way that I do this is I'm typically looking to slow my shutter speed down to about 1/60th of a second, or sometimes even 1/30th of a second. And then what I'm looking for either my model to do or for me to do is just tiny, tiny bits of motion. So even when you've got a really experienced model who's very good at posing, by slowing the shutter down just a little bit, you soften the focus on their skin, you create sort of a dreamy feel to a lot of the work that's being created. And to me, it really elevates a lot of the portraits and gets it away from feeling like a headshot or something that is really, really deliberately super, super in focus. There's a slightly more, by my interpretation, artistic feel to these photos. So let's look at some examples. In this case, you can see that the model is just slightly softened in terms of the focus. Her hair looks softer, her skin looks softer, the highlights are a little bit more even, and it was a really nice way in this particular photo shoot that we shot outdoors in Central Park last fall to add a sense of sort of dreaminess to the close of summer. And this works, by the way, in black and white or in color. I tend to shoot a lot in black and white. It's really my preference. But even on color edits of digital photos or looking at color film in your photography, you can really apply this same technique. You can see here that I also did a more extreme version of this that's closer to the effect that you might have when panning. In this particular case, I slowed the shutter down more than my usual 1/60th or 1/30th of a second and asked the model to throw her head back. And it really created this sense of motion that you can see where the model looks as though she's in the midst of an emotional movement, and it really adds a sense of drama to the photo. This also works with men's photography. So you can see here in this shoot, this model who I just worked with recently, he's signed to a major agency. He's really good at posing. He's obviously very photogenic and really good looking. And we experimented with both super in focus, sort of normal fashion photos, but also taking a slightly editorial bend to some of them. When I slowed the shutter down and asked him to move just slightly, or I moved just slightly, and it really softens the image, you know, particularly with men, it can be nice to soften the image just a little bit because, especially if you are photographing men who are not models, there is a tendency for us to want to look, you know, big and hard and muscular. Even if we're trying to look friendly, we have this sort of natural inclination to try and freeze up a little bit. And by slowing your shutter down, particularly with men, you can soften the images quite a bit and add a little bit more drama and grace to the image that to me looks really, really beautiful. You can use this in fashion photography. You can also use this in portrait photography. So as you're looking at trying to get creative with the ways that you are shooting different types of people and models, whether they're experienced models or not, you can use this technique to really elevate the output of the shoot. And take it from me, people who are not models, who see themselves in such a beautiful, sort of slow shutter way where their bodies are in motion, they love it. They go nuts for it. You can use this in engagements. You can use this in weddings. You can certainly use this in portraits, in fashion and street, as I've talked about here. So listen, sincerely, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it was inspiring, and I hope that it gets you to try something new within your photography. I'd love to see what you try. Send me a message on Instagram or shoot me an email. I'd love to see some of the images that you create coming out of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. It really, really helps. Again, I thank you so much, and until the next video, peace.